All right, welcome back, art history students, to the last little video get together of the semester. Today we're talking about portrait comparisons, and we're sort of exploring Europe, North America, and the Pacific Islands, and how each of these groups felt about portraiture and used portraiture in their uh, lives. So let's jump right into that with a super brief review. So if you remember from the Rococo and Art Academies video, um, art academies followed a strict sort of genre regiment, and that was history painting, so sort of neoclassicism, looking to the stories and culture and mythology of Greece and Rome, and then re-exploring that in painting. Um, Landscapes, still lives, and portraits. And portraits are very influential for a very long time, much past the influence of art academies. Even today, wealthy individuals will often get their portrait painted. So we're gonna explore this idea of getting your portrait painted versus having like a photograph of you taken. All right, so let's pretend for a moment that you are getting your portrait painted, right? So you know that this portrait will outlast you, it'll outlast your children and your children's. It'll be around forever. And you have all of this freedom that painting provides, that having an image of you taken on with a camera does not. So you can be depicted differently than you actually exist, right? That painting that we saw of Louis, right? He was very much in his 60s when that painting was painted, but the artist painted him in this younger light as more prime. So you have that option. You could be painted in a younger prime, or you could actually depict yourself as older and wiser than you really are. You can be in a place of your choosing, even if that place doesn't really exist, because you have that freedom that painting provides. You can be with others, or you can be alone. You can be with others who no longer live. You can have your portrait next to each other, in an image that never really happened. You can have objects of significance with you, and what would they be? So I want you just to kind of think about that. Where are you in your theoretical portrait painting scenario? Are you old? Are you young? Are you wise? Are you with others? Are you alone? How are you dressed? Just give yourself a minute to think about those kinds of things. And then we'll talk about how others viewed and used this freedom that painting provides. All right. So in the very European tradition, which is where the portrait sort of comes from, or this idea of portraits as we know them, is very much for an upper class individuals, people who are struggling to economically survive, oftentimes don't have the luxury of having their portrait painted. And we can see from this image that oftentimes you're displaying yourself and sort of the wealth that you have. So this portrait would very likely have been sort of a portrait created to allure suitors to this woman. So she's like the princess at this time frame. So it may have been that then this portrait would be sent to a king or a duke or whatever of some other European culture in a way to express who you are, and what's valuable to you and how pretty you are, those sorts of things. So it is very much cosmetic. It's what you have and what you look like here. There isn't a whole lot going on deep inside, especially with these European portraits. In some cases, we'll see others that it's not. All right, so this is another example of that. So what are the things that we can see from this woman? We see that she has these sort of Greek style vases here. So she's sort of intellectual. She has this historical knowledge. This was very like important at the time, is that you were well read into the history of Greece and Rome, specifically that idea of antiquity. If you knew about those cultures, it was sort of like an intellectual thing. So we see this woman here, she's dressed kind of modestly, especially by comparison to the princess portrait that we just saw, but she still has this sort of like luxurious couch behind her, this sort of chair here with some other clothes, and this like extravagant rug. So she still is definitely putting out this note that I am an intellectual and I am wealthy. Right? Those are just some of the statements that she's making with this portrait of herself. All right. So next we're going to talk about Maurice de Talleyrand. I think I am pronouncing that correctly. So we're going to dive into this guy as a portrait subject a little bit more. So we're just going to call him Charles Maurice. He was one of a general in Napoleon's army, right? So we see him here, and he's at his desk. So he is a well-read, well-educated individual, right? He has his military sort of symbol on, so the French military. But then we see behind him, sort of tossed onto this chair, his hat, his sort of general hat that would have been one of the indicators of his social status within the military. So it sort of is tossed back there in this disregard, and he sort of has this letter on the table that he's currently writing. So what happened is this gentleman, Charles Maurice, left the military. He disagreed with Napoleon, disagreed with some of the things that he was doing, and he had enough political power, we'll say, or enough wealth that he was able to just walk away from his post in the military, and then also made public statements about it. So that's what we see here. We see this moment. This is supposed to represent the moment that he has gone and has left the military and returned home, right? He's still in his military suit, still proclaiming that I was and am this level of general, but I've tossed it aside, and now I'm going to tell you why. Those are all of the things that he's communicating to you in this portrait of himself. So let's move on. All right, this is another example of the same individual, this Charles Maurice, right? And we have this is from a slightly later date. So we can see that he's communicating a lot of those same things. He's still sort of standing. He's no longer in his military garb. He's now sort of a civilian status, or at least a princely civilian status. But he's choosing to have his image painted along with these sort of Romanesque busts, right? And that was a status symbol all the way back in ancient Rome. If you can remember from earlier in the class, you would have these sort of busts made of your ancestors. So these are both his ancestors and some folks from antiquity, meaning Greece or Roman philosophers and whatnot. So he's letting us know that he comes from this very important lineage. He's also letting us know that he's wealthy, of course, and that he's well-read and well-educated. So these are some of the big major things that Europeans are putting forward in their portraits and how they choose to have their portraits painted, right? And it's what's important to them. Obviously, social status is important. Obviously, sort of the intellect, or inclining that you have this intellect, also that you have wealth, that you're this individual of social status, right? And this individual with things to say, things to put forward, contributing to society in a lot of ways, especially with this Charles Maurice individual. So let's now shift, and we're going to look at some other examples of portraiture. All right. So if you guys remember the Maori from the last little video lecture that you watched. So these are the people who do the individualized tattoos on their faces denoting their story, right? So you get these individualized tattoos at specific life events like puberty and marriage and all those other kind of large life events. And then that's put right on your face, so right for others to see you're not only an individual, you're sort of an individual with a specific story. So these Maori were colonized by Europeans. That is not an uncommon thing in history. All right. So when the Maori were colonized by Europeans, they still held their own ground a lot, which was uncommon in this colonial time. In this colonial time, it would sort of be like Europeans would come in and they would just sort of take over all aspects of indigenous people's lives, right? So the Maori were able to create sort of like a distance or a buffer between their culture and the European culture, or the European invading culture. And they did this through emissaries, right? Which are sort of like these liaisons between the indigenous and the Europeans. They were very powerful people. They were not able to just be sort of run over and conquered very quickly. There's also, I guess you could call it like a rumor that the Maori were not the original people of New Zealand. They came and conquered another group before then and were also known to be cannibals. So I think that may have kind of allowed the Europeans to keep their distance from them. Again, that's like a rumor kind of thing. So maybe they just told them that so that they would keep their distance from them. So we can see here from this portrait that we have that sort of that merging of cultures, right? So this is one of those emissaries, or one of those liaisons between the indigenous. We can see from his facial tattoos and sort of this kiwi bird that he wears in his ear and the feathers in his hair, that he is a man of indigenous descent, but he has European clothes on. So he has this sort of like wealthy seat at the table, discussing and proclaiming. So he's proclaiming two things to two different cultures in this portrait, that he's sort of from this group, but also deals and works within the rules and the system of the European culture. So that's a powerful statement. So the portraits that were created of the Maori, there were a lot of them, and the major individual to do this was Gottfried Lindauer. So when Lindauer came and painted these portraits, the Maori people loved them. They were very, very well received by the individuals who were in the paintings. They had this belief that each individual had a mana or a spirit. And this sort of coincides with their facial tattoos, right? So your mana or spirit is individual to you based on your sort of life events and the things that happen to you and whatnot. And that spirit can be preserved in an image of you. So they were very, very fond of having their portraits painted. And commonly they would have this kind of devoid background, or sort of, it puts me in mind of like, remember when you got your school photo taken and there was sort of that strange backlit piece of marble paper behind you? It's sort of, some of the portraits of the Maori have that kind of devoid background. And that was all the more well received by them because that meant that their sort of mana or their spirit was the main thing that was on display in these images. So the Maori loved to have their portrait painted, and it was also, so these portraits served two economic groups at this time. Both the Maori were purchasing them and enjoyed them and loved having their portraits painted, but also the European market. So a lot of these it was a very popular thing during this colonizational time frame for artists to go to these remote locations of the world and sort of paint and document indigenous people and then send them back. And that was a way for the Europeans to sort of see and know and learn about indigenous folks. Remember when we saw those European images, one thing that we noted in a couple of them was that the people were trying to express the fact that they were well read and well informed and had this sort of historical knowledge or something to say, right? So being well-rounded was very important to the Europeans of the time. So that made a market for them to send these indigenous photo or indigenous portraits back to. Okay, so just to reiterate that point, so here is a portrait of a Maori woman, right? So we see that she has that sort of elementary school portrait background that's sort of devoid, but there's like that slight amount of light that comes off of it. Again, so she has her own sort of individual story or individual tattoo. Remember, these tattoos are different, each individual, and then sometimes the more common for the women to have just sort of the chin area, and then the men, as they get older, it's sort of the whole face, or at least that's the traditional, they're all individualized. So when we compare and contrast this image to that of the sort of European image, there's nothing in the background. It is very much so about this individual, their individual story that's sort of both on display but also personal to them, that they are the ones who know. And then in comparison to those European portraits, it's all about the stuff that's around them and what that stuff has to say, right? Like the stuff that I have these, Egyptian or Roman vases in my house, and I have this knowledge about this ancient culture and whatnot. So it's like stuff tells your story. And then to the Maori, you are your story and your mana and who you are. So it's just a different way of looking at portraiture. Both of these cultures are very happy to have their portraits painted. All right. So moving on, the next group that we're going to talk about is portraiture of Native Americans specifically Plains Indians. And the major artist who made these portraits was George Catlin. You may or may not have heard of Catlin. So Catlin was the first, this is straight from his website, white man to depict the Plains Indians in their native territory. So he traveled. He was a American painter, but he had been educated in Europe. So again, like I said before, there's this massive, there is a market for paintings of indigenous Native Americans and indigenous from other cultures in Europe and America at this time. And George Catlin is chronologically a little bit later than Robert Lindau or Godfred Lindauer, who we just talked about with the Maori. So this is considered to be one of Catlin's finest work, and this is Buffalo Bill's back fat, which is the head chief of the blood tribe. And we see a lot of things, Catlin is doing a lot of things that we're familiar with. So there isn't really very much of a background. There's sort of this sky background, and this chief is sort of depicted with all of his stuff that indicates who he is, right? So he has his sort of headdress on, he has his sort of ceremonial garb, and he's holding this instrument or this object. So let's look at a couple other examples. Here we see a warrior. So there was a little bit of information that Lindauer would gain from these Indians before he painted their portrait, and he would talk about how sometimes certain objects were done in a certain reason. So one of the things with this one is that the feathers in the headdress have been clipped and are there to communicate this warrior's military exploits or his, military victories and whatnot. But Lindauer didn't 100% get this right. This is probably one of the best images that Lindauer got wrong. So one of the major differences between Europeans and their idea of a portrait and the Maori and their idea of a portrait is that both those groups are very individualized. I want to show in my portrait how I am different from you and how me and my story play out, whether it's through objects or through my individual sort of denotation of my story and my life events. Native Americans are very different. They're very communal, right? So this culture was very, very communal. If they had had a say in how their portrait would be depicted, it would not be an isolated. It would be sort of like a group picture or a group image. They do everything together. That's how they progress. That's how they see themselves, as part of a collective, not necessarily as individuals. So they didn't really understand why they were getting their portrait painted. They didn't value these portraits. They didn't have the same influence on the Native American culture as, say, the portrait painting did on the Maori. So they were not for them. These images are not for the Native Americans. It's not for the people who are actually being depicted. It's sort of this very European lens or eye put on a culture that doesn't necessarily even think in the same way. So a good example of this is this gentleman here in this painting. So he has his sort of bow and arrow out, but yet he's wearing, one source that I read said that these boots would have been for dancing in a ritual dance. So they're not the boots that you wear hunting. They're for this other very specific ritual. And it's probably common to say that basically what they think happened, or what historians think, was that Catlin would sort of arrive and he would say, I want to paint your portrait. And then he would say, like, I want you to wear all this stuff. And it didn't mean anything or make any sense to the person who was having their portrait painted. Like, these are different garbs, right? That's another sort of vocabulary word that we just learned. Different garbs for different things. So it would be like having your portrait painted in high heels with your power tools. Like, they don't go together. So that's just some of the ways in which the Native Americans viewed having their portrait painted differently than specifically the Maori, right? So it's the same lens, it's the same sort of European lens being put on two different cultures, and one culture is really absorbing it and enjoying it, and it fits with their worldview, and the other culture is not necessarily fitting with that same worldview or that same view of individualism. All right, so here we have 3 portraits. So now I'm going to talk about your assignment. On a normal semester, when we have a normal test, I put these 3 portraits up, and then I make you guys flip your test over and draw one of these things right here on the back of it, right? You guys are all familiar with the Venn diagram, right? And I want you to compare and contrast these images, who they are, what, when, where, why, how, who was it for, how did they enjoy it, whatnot. I've pretty much given you all the information in this video. If you need to Google something, try not to do that. This is part of your test. So use the information that I've provided. Now, the format for this, I'm going to kind of let you guys do. So if you want to draw your Venn diagram on a piece of paper and write it all out and take a picture of it and then submit it that way. You can do it that way. If you're tech savvy and want to create it in Word or Excel or whatever your sort of, I'm kind of open to this. This is a little bit of an experiment. This is a very experimental semester for everyone. So I want to see what you guys can do, what you're able to do. So my only sort of request is please use a common file format. Please use, even if you make it in, say, Photoshop or something like that, if you're savvy like that, or some kind of other program that I don't have, so I might not be able to open it, please save it as a PDF or an image or a JPEG or something like that. So this is going to be worth 25 points. That 25 points is going to go towards your final exam grade. So be wary of that. And again, I just try to get creative with it. Again, I will accept if you just draw it and then take a picture of it. I will also accept that. But if you can do something creative with this, that's a little bit up to you. So if you have any questions, please email me. Thank you so very much.